So thank you guys for joining us. My name is Chris Hawkins. I am one of the co-chairs of the Chicago chapter of the Horror Writers Association. We have members, all the way from Northwest Indiana all the way up to southern Wisconsin. So we cover a pretty large area, and we're all about helping to advance horror as a genre and helping to get horror writers together for networking and provide scholarship opportunities. It's a great organization. So if you're interested in horror writing at all, please check us out. I'm going to let everyone sort of introduce themselves. We're going to go down the table, so please just a quick introduction. Tell us a little bit about who you are and the things you write.
Yeah, so I write under Essell, Pratt, and I write a lot of B-movie type horror, also a little bit of fantasy, even have another pen name, H.P. Laurie, that does clean romance, kind of as a, my wife kind of told me you can't do that, so I just did it. Been writing since about 2012.
And I'm Jonathan Janz, and I'm from about 90 minutes away from here in West Lafayette, Indiana, where I teach. And it's just a blast to be here.
Daniel Kraus, author of books, obviously, ranging from middle grade kids through adult, and then graphic novels, some TV film work, but mostly books of work. The heart is.
Joe Scipione, I also write books. Mr. Nightmare is my most popular one, and I got a handful of other books too, all kind of in that horror genre.
I'm Damian Serbu, an author of gay speculative fiction, primarily in the vampire genre. I have 7 novels out with 9 Star Press.
So as I neglected to mention at the beginning of the panel, we are here to talk about the art of horror writing. The panel is called Crafting Chills. I will be moderating the discussion. We'll be taking questions from the audience, so if you guys have any questions as we're going, feel free to raise your hand. If not, I got lots of questions. We'll keep it covered. So first thing I want to ask you guys, though, is what brought you to writing? How did you start? What was sort of the genesis of the journey that you're on? So I'm going to start at the end with Damian.
Yeah, I started, I think, just because I had stories rumbling around in my head. I'm an academically trained historian, and so everything has to be factually based. You have to have sources for everything that you write about, and I was looking for some kind of release, some hobby to get away from all of that. And I've always liked horror, so I just decided, well, these weird stories that rumble through my head, and they need a voice somewhere, so I just started writing. That was kind of the inspiration.
Yeah, I'm actually also went to school for history. I have multiple degrees, and one of the classes I took in undergrad, the final exam was to write a creative fiction story about all of the stuff that we had learned during the school year. So then I wrote it, and I was like, wow, this is actually really fun. I kind of like making stuff up versus writing the more factual stuff. And then from there I just started writing more.
Started writing maybe like in first grade, and that was really as a means to, it was kind of just like a way to play. I had a friend who lived in my neighborhood, and we drew pictures of monsters, and so we each had a little folder, and they were sort of like, they probably were like Star Wars figures type of monsters, Hammerhead and Walrus Man and Godzilla type of monsters. And eventually we would want something to do with the monsters. We had amassed all these monsters, so we'd write stories where the monsters attacked each other, which again were really just plotless Godzilla type bashing. And then I just, progressed from there, hopefully.
Yeah, I got started, I think that when I was little, I grew up next to a graveyard, and so that always would spur my imagination. My mom was into Twilight Zone, and then she would bring albums of Edgar Allan Poe stories, so I was listening to those at like age 4 or 5. So I remember when I was 5 listening to The Pit and the Pendulum. But that's what kind of I think set the groundwork for horror for me. And I think that, like, the person, this is not unique at all, but Stephen King really inspired me to start writing stories, and a little bit like what you said, I wasn't aware that I needed writing. I wasn't aware that I needed to express in that way. But once I did, it made me feel good in a way that nothing else had made me feel good before. It was just so healthy, and so anytime I hear somebody, I'm writing a book or whatever, I just think that's a wonderful thing, right? Regardless of whether they're going to be published or not. And I just think to be able to express yourself is such a healthy thing and so good for your emotions and well-being. So I'll shut up. Go ahead.
So I think I've always had an active imagination as I was a kid. I'd always play out the stories with my toys, and then as I grew older, the stories still were there. I'd see something, a leaf fall, and a story would just kind of be created out of that. And so as I got older and got into more of a career, I'm now in IT for my day job. I'm a CIO at a community college, and then I spent the last 10 years working on degrees, so a lot of technical work. I defended my dissertation yesterday, so it's a lot of technical work. So the story is just kind of, as others said, it's stuff that you can make up, and you don't have to worry about the technical details of those things you're focusing on, and just kind of expand that imagination.
Awesome. So now that you guys have been doing this for a while, I'm going to open this up to anyone who wants to answer. What are your daily, weekly writing habits, and are there any writing rituals that you have to follow, any places you have to be, any special pens, anything like that? Anyone who wants to answer this one.
I'll do it. I write full-time, so I just treat it as if I'm clocking into the factory. I get up and jump to the shower, I get out, eat as I'm sort of logging on and getting my documents set, and then just write all day. Clock out around 4 maybe, and I write 6 days a week. I did 7 for a long time, and my wife finally convinced me to take Sundays off, and it's gotten better, but for a while those Sundays I was just pacing around like a lion. I just really, really like to write. As far as like rituals, I try not to have any. That way it can open you up. I mean, I'm sort of a workaholic because I like it so much. So I don't want to have to do one thing. I want to be able to write on a plane or in an airport or in a hotel room. So I think generally that's a good thing to at least strive for, so that it's there can be fewer excuses, and it's sort of like I said, clocking into work. It's like, in most jobs, you don't have an option. You just have to work whether or not you have the right pen or not. They'll give you a different pen. So that's how I approach it anyway.
Can I ask a question in regards to that?
Sure.
Do you break up like writing and editing into that, or do you focus on one book until it's done, writing, editing, all that, or is it like you kind of like 50% of my day I'm gonna write, next 50 I'm gonna edit a different book, and then or is it one book until it's done, or do you do kind of multiple?
It varies. I mean, as much as possible, I think most people would agree with this, as much as possible focus on one thing.
Mm-hmm.
If it's possible to just write one book until it's done, that's the ideal. Sometimes it's possible, and I would break up between books. I might do 4 days on one book and 2 days on another. And regarding the kind of work, whether it's writing or editing, it just depends what stage the books are in.
Mhm.
That doesn't matter much.
I tend to have one major project, but then a couple minor ones on the side. I like to dabble and have a little variety in case this one gets a little stale or I want to do something different. So I have those other 2 I go to. There's still the main one that's a focus, but I like to have maybe 3 going at a time. And then the other thing that you asked about editing, the only thing, if my publisher all of a sudden comes and says, hey, here's the proofs of this, you have a day to get it back to us. That blows the whole thing up, and that becomes the focus real fast, which isn't quite as fun, but a necessary evil.
Yeah, well, I kind of agree with what he said. I'll have a first draft that I'll go through and I'll write all the way through that. and then I'll kind of want to leave that for a little bit, and I'll edit something else, or write it, you know, a short story or something smaller, then I'll go back and edit that. So I'm always working kind of with 2 or 3 things at once, so it's kind of like a cycle for me.
I think for me, I tend to do some pretty detailed outlines for novels, but then I'm kind of by the pants for short stories. So I'll work on my novels, try to do a chapter every couple days, knowing it's gonna be a really rough draft, I can go back to it later. And then as I kind of get, you know, in that and kind of at a stopping point, I might go to a short story and focus on that for a couple days or a week or so, and then go back to the book. And just kind of go back and forth, but I don't try to set any solid goals for myself. I just try to do what I can with the time that I have.
And that leads into my answer, because I have very different schedules. During the summer, I'm Daniel. When I have more time, I'll write all day, or at least a good part of the day. And I treat it like that, like clocking in, and then you work until a certain time. And then during the school year, I'm teaching, and so I really have to have my focus there. And I love teaching and all that stuff, but it's just a very different feeling. And the weekends and breaks are yet another, right? So those are when I try to play catch up for all the time I don't get to write during the week. So sometimes on the weekends, and especially like during fall break, winter break, I'll have these giant bursts of creativity and output, and yeah, I mean, you find a way to make it work, but you write as much as you can, whenever you can.
I have a question.
Yeah.
For you specifically.
Yeah.
Because I know like how busy your life is. Do you ever get like an idea that pops in your head, but then you know you have like your kid's soccer game, or like there's piano lessons, and you're like, God, I just want to sit down and like write. Like, do you like be like, okay, writer's note, you know, outline, blah blah blah, in your phone? Like, what do you do in that situation?
Yeah, constantly. I'm constantly feeling that way. I have, yeah, and I do just what you showed me. I use my phone for notes, and I'll make like a video. I should do voice memos. That would make more sense, but I do a video instead. I don't know why. So it'll be like, you know, a video. I'll be sitting in the parking lot, and so the video will be of a steering wheel, and then I talking over that, right? Like the least interesting movie ever. But yeah, no, I think I find that I do that. I find that it helps, because the creative engine, that sounds so pompous or whatever for me to say it that way, but that creative engine never shuts off, right? It's always fertile, it's always active, and so yeah, I think that that's super important. You know, I spent a lot of the summer at my son's baseball games, his travel baseball, because that's so, you know, absolutely absorbing with time and energy. So yeah, that's I do it exactly the way that you're guessing, and it's very helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so kind of building off of that, like so for the rest of you, what other techniques do you guys have for capturing ideas sort of in the moment when you don't have the ability to just jump into, you know, and get them down on the page? How do you preserve those thoughts?
I'm very similar. I will use the notes function on my phone, and I'll write kind of a brief blurb or description of what it is. And then I'll go back to it usually about a week later or so and kind of do like a preliminary title for what that could be. And then that kind of keeps it organized for myself, and then it kind of just goes into my to-be-written pile, which gets pretty large.
I've just got those moleskin notebooks. I've got a drawer full of moleskin notebooks, and that's where all the notes go. So I carry that with me almost everywhere. Every once in a while I get caught out without it, and then I go to the phone. Voice memos, because I'm not a monster. But all those then tend to get, unless they're immediate notes for something I'm writing right then, I then will listen to and hand copy back into the moleskin, because I want everything in one place. Because I'm taking notes on things I may not write for 10 years sometimes. So it's like, I gotta have everything in one contained spot. So occasionally I'll do passes through my voice memos or notes app just to make sure I've cleared them all out. I delete everything, so I just have everything in print.
Yeah.
I use the phone also. I have an app, it's called Evernote. I was doing it in my phone, like the regular notes app, and I just have like thousands of notes, and Evernote lets you like organize them and stuff. So I use that, and I just type down stuff whenever I get a thought, and it just stays in there.
Yeah, I'm really old school. I have to write it down. The phone, I just don't even think of putting a note there for myself. I'm like, that commercial that's out there right now where the mom's gonna put a note on her iPhone. iPhone, so she literally takes a Post-it note out and writes on it, that's me.
Mm.
So, yeah, if I'm out and I can't write it down immediately, I do some kind of like anagram or something in my head so I'll remember the idea. And I have to have a little thing of Post-its next to my bed, because sometimes the ideas come in the middle of the night. And if I don't write it down, I'll stay up trying to remember it. So I found that kind of helps release it. The problem is about 50% of the time, the next morning, I look at it and I'm like, oh, I think that was my Pulitzer Prize idea. And I don't know what that says. I got nothing there.
Something that's helpful is I've got a pen that can write upside down to get ink to gravity defying pen. So if I've got notes in the bed, I don't have to, I can just write like that.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, they're not expensive or anything.
Amazon plug.
I thought I saw a question, yeah.
I have a question. Do any of you ever write chapters out of order, or do you actually do it straight up in order? Because my friend and I write stories together, and I write it all the way in order, and I recently looked at her rough draft, and I could not deal with it because she writes stuff out of order. She's like, oh, I'll come back to this paragraph, and she leaves a space. And I just thought that was crazy, but how do you guys do it?
That is a great question. So you guys write things, front to back in order, or do you jump around?
I couldn't jump around. I think it's the historian in me, like I'm very linear thinking that way, so I've never jumped around. It would make me nervous.
Yeah, right.
So I have I call it like a scaffold. Like I have 5 or 6 or 7 different plot points I'm gonna try to get to. So I don't write them out, but I know the ending, and I know a couple important scenes in the middle, and I know the beginning. So I just write to the next one, but I don't write them all out.
I think writing out of order is madness. Your characters, whoever, they're gonna change and progress through the. I can see it if you had a really, really well outlined, maybe you could do it. The only thing I can think of that is along those lines is sometimes when I'm doing something that's really science heavy, or there's some, there's just some fact that I don't want to interrupt the flow and go figure out. I might skip a paragraph and say, I don't know how the whale stomach does this, and then I'll just come back to that. But I certainly wouldn't wait very long, because even that might have ramifications.
Yeah, well, no, I'm like that most of the time. I do things in a linear fashion most of the time. There are rare occasions when I descend into the madness that he's alluding to, but I think it's a little, the way I do it is at least to me a little intuitive, but it's when there is a backstory of a character, and I already know like where we're going to end up, and I know what that character's like, but I haven't revealed certain facets of the character, but I know what the character's backstory is. So then I'll go ahead and do those, just because often I'm really eager to get to that stuff, because sometimes that's the good stuff, right? Sometimes that's the really twisted, awful stuff. And I'm doing that with my current work in progress, just because this character is revealed to be someone awful later in the book, but I haven't gotten to the reveal yet. But then after the reveal, then I give the backstory of how she got to be that way. So it's not often, but occasionally I'll do stuff out of order. 95% of the time it's in order.
Yeah, I think that's why my friend does it. She's so eager to get to stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's impatience.
I mean, the challenge, the ideal is that everything's the good stuff.
Yeah.
And that there's
Sure.
there's nothing that you don't want to write.
Sure.
Like that's probably not doubting your book, that's probably a bad sign. If there's chapters you don't want to write. But I'm sure you'll fix them and they're going to be great.
And I'd say overall mine are pretty linear, one chapter after the next. The exceptions would be if, as I'm writing and I start to deviate from my outline, I always outline my books with all the blank chapters in the document, and then I might go to that chapter and just write a quick note saying, I'm going to do this instead of what I originally said. Just a note. The other exception is I write a lot of short stories. So sometimes those short stories, they kind of start growing in my head and they become something bigger. My first book was actually born from a short story that I had published in an anthology. And then I started thinking more and more about it, and that actually became the last chapter in that book. So I guess I kind of wrote that one out of order, but I mean, I'm also planning 2 sequels, which are also both prequels to that, so yeah, I guess that is in there. So.
So on a related question, and I know this is kind of a pain point for some authors, so if you don't want to answer, that's totally fine. But how clean are your first drafts? How much, generally speaking, I know it can vary, but generally speaking, when you finish that first draft, how close is it to the final product that you're going to then end up with?
Not clean at all. Like I just type, I don't care about spelling or punctuation and stuff, I just type and I just keep going. And then I'll go back. I edit stuff 7 or 8 times before anybody else even reads it, so not clean at all.
Mine are absolutely hideous. Mine are absolute just wrecks. They're what they really are. They're so bad. And so Stephen King's, in On Writing, he says that final draft equals rough draft minus 10%. For me, it's final draft equals rough draft minus 40%. Like, and you'd think, given my time constraints, given the fact that I've got this other job, you'd think that I'd be more efficient. But I just, like the way that I work, I have to feel liberated, I have to feel free, I just go. But that often means that there are some wrong turnings and issues, and I would be so mortified if anybody ever saw one of my rough drafts. So they look wildly different than the final draft. I don't know how many times, I spend far more time, usually 3 times the amount of time editing as I do writing. So yeah, my rough drafts are just total garbage.
That Stephen King calculation feels way off.
Yeah, for me it is. Yeah.
10%.
I know, like how can you be that sure of that, right? Yeah.
Well, have you read some of his books that are like this big? And you're kind of like, that could have been a little shorter there, Steve.
Kind of makes sense for him.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say my first drafts are garbage. Everything is there. And again, if it involves a lot of research or science or something, it's all going to be in there. I'm not going to skip that in a draft. I definitely spend, I think, the most time. I don't like you spend more time editing. I probably spend more time on the first draft than I do editing. But it changes. It changes a lot. Like usually the story and bones, they're all kind of set in the first draft. But every single sentence is going to change in the subsequent draft. Every single sentence, as I go through word by word, fancy it up.
Would you say that with experience, your first drafts of your first novels compared to your first drafts of your new novels has that changed, or is it still, that's pretty much bad the whole, because like my editor, she keeps saying things like, the reason I'm having you fix these things and not me is so that your next novel that you send me, there won't be these issues that I have fixed because you're going to catch them the first time. So would you say that like your experience now of editing your own novels or having editors edit them and tell you like, you don't have the word simply in there 500 times because it's something you catch, like, oh, I shouldn't use that word 500 times. Would you say your new first drafts are so much better than like your first drafts?
Yes, is this to me?
The whole panel. Because you're
I can't see your
sorry,
eyes, I can't
sorry. The whole panel.
Generally, yes. The first earlier books had worse first drafts.
Yeah.
I'm much better at it now.
Yeah, I'd agree with mine too. I think I'm more confident in the first drafts now. I think with my first books, I was really kind of like corralling myself into like being really safe and in a really like direct spot, and now I let myself just kind of expand and explore and so on. So, but even still, even though I feel that they're better, I mean, as with others, once I get into the actual editing part, I realize it's nowhere near as what I thought it was going to be, and it takes a lot of work to get it where it's published.
I think also like just the more you practice something, the better you're going to get at it. So the first book you write is never going to be as good as the 50th book because you practice for so long. And also, I think, for me, I know I have a bunch of idiosyncrasies, and the more stuff gets edited and looked at by other people, they start to point it out and they see it, and then I realize how much I do something, and then I cut it out on my own as I'm typing that first draft.
Yeah, I think my rough drafts are cleaner now, they're tighter. Especially I don't put as much history in it. I kind of know the balance now better than at the beginning. I was like, everybody needs to know like every fact about the French Revolution, and it's like, no, if they want that, they'll go read the history of the French Revolution. So that's helped narrow it down. But you know, like Daniel, I think that my main story, the body and everything, doesn't change that radically. It's the grammar and the structure of the sentence that I edit as I go along.
Mine are better garbage. And I think they're garbage in a different way. The way when I started out, I just didn't have any idea what I was doing. So on every level, you know, like the voice wasn't as strong and that sort of thing. Now, like, I'm not saying it's polished right away, but I think the writing is much better now. But where I go astray, when you watch like behind the scenes, when you listen to people talk about television and film, like they're like the TV show The Office. There's The Office, and there's Superfans episodes of The Office that are longer. So the normal episodes are 21 minutes, and the Superfans are like 29 or 34 minutes. And Steve Carell, I saw or a podcast. He said that he always ended up agreeing with the editors. Right, there's some great scenes that are left on the cutting room floor, but it's just they're not necessary. They're not as needed, and that's what I find myself doing to my drafts now. It's like this is interesting, but does it need to stay? Right? Does it? And that's where I end up always being ruthless, usually. Right? And then I feel like later on I tell myself this, but you know, I'll do a different edition, and I'll put these like in the addendum at the end. But yeah, I think that's where. It feels, I don't want it to feel meandering, kind of like my answer. I want it to feel very focused and tight, and that's why I end up cutting a lot back.
I got a question. It's along the lines. What if you guys have a part in your story that you absolutely love and feel that it's the bones of the whole story, and your editor makes you cut it? I mean, does that ever happen to you guys? No?
It's because they're all amazing.
Well, yeah, but that's
I mean, editor ain't gonna make me cut anything.
It's
not their fault.
story. Well, and that's, I always wonder that, because I know that they make you do like, you know, gosh, how many rewrites, you know, on certain things, but I was curious to see if there was ever parts in there that they cut out, or they're saying, look, this is just not working, you need to rewrite this. So it was just
I mean, there's lots of comments, but I don't think, I've never been forced to do anything. There's all sorts of different kinds of editors out there. I've had editors who, you know, edit a book with a phone call, and then I've had editors who send 20 pages of notes, you know. But I don't have to follow any of them. I end up following most of them, but I don't think that's specific things, probably all that common. It's more the spirit of the thing, I think, and the overall gist of what they're trying to say. But you can come up with, like they may say, this doesn't work, get rid of it, and something works. But you may keep it and fix it in a way they hadn't thought of by doing something else. So there's other routes that are less straightforward.
Well, I didn't know if that was like a make or break. Like, say for example, like if you don't get rid of this, you know, we're not publishing this book. You know what I'm saying? Like if it touches on certain lines.
I'd be interested if anyone's had a situation like that.
I kind of did. The Scent is a Vampire had a previous publisher, and they had accepted it, and we were all the way to editing. And the editor came back and said, you can't, the publisher doesn't want you to have any references to Jesus throughout the book. And I'm like, it's about Christmas. Like, there's a scene where they steal a baby Jesus out of a nativity set, and it's like, you know, it was getting tense. So I went to the publisher, and the publisher said, well, that's not our policy, that's not a rule. And I said, but your editor said that. And she's like, yeah, but I don't agree with that. Well, then can you tell your editor? No, she's the editor. And it just got crazy enough that we just pulled the plug. I said, I'm gone. I'm going somewhere else. And that's when I ended up at 9 Stars. So that was the closest I had to it. But again, even in that case, it was my my book, I had editorial control over it. They couldn't force me to get rid of that stuff.
Well, it's good. It's good that you guys stick to your grounds if that's the case when something like that happens, so. Cool.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, you're right.
I think my biggest challenges or my biggest contentious moments have occurred on the agent level. I've had a couple different agents, and sometimes we'll have some pretty, I don't know, deep conversations and frustrating conversations. With my last agent, I'm not going to name her. She was good. She really knew what she was doing, all that stuff. But the agent before the one I have now, she got to a point where she felt like, okay, so this is, I don't even know if I should share this, but whatever. She did not want it to be apparent in any of my books that there was definitely a supernatural element. That no matter what I wrote, it had to have an earthly explanation as well as a potentially supernatural explanation. And if you think about it, that rules out quite a bit,
Yeah.
right? And then that's probably why we parted ways. And I just kept thinking, I was trying to like fit my stories into her framework, and I'm like, this is ridiculous. This is changing the story too much, right? I don't want to leave everything ambiguous in every novel. And so that was eventually why we parted ways. So that got pretty intense. With my current one, the biggest challenge is always number of characters. I think every reader has preferences, right? We all have things we like, don't like, things toward which we gravitate. She wants fewer characters. And I understand the need for that. I think it's, if you've got 4 friends of the main character, they better all have a good reason for being there, right? Because maybe 3 would be better because they'd be more distinct. But that's the big conversation we always end up having, and have that with a book that's on submission now.
Well, you don't want another stand on your hands, right?
What's that?
You don't want another stand on your hands?
That's the cast, that's the size of the cast I wanted, right?
That's a lot of people's favorite, yeah.
So, kind of building off of that, like everybody kind of giving you notes about your work. What would you say is like the best piece, this is more general, but what's the best piece of writing advice you've ever gotten? Or conversely, what's the worst? And feel free to pick either or both.
I think for me, it came in the beginning, it was just to write. Just go through it, write it, and just get it done. I found that a lot of times in my really earlier works, before I started writing seriously, I would write the same first chapter for months over and over again and never go any further than that. And then I would write, finally get to a chapter being done, but then I wouldn't go further until I get that to where I thought it was perfect, and it was never perfect. So once I learned to just write, then things started moving more smoothly for me.
I think it was really important for me that somebody said, just write your truth, your stories. Don't fret about the market or what people expect or try to figure out what's going to be the next trend in horror. Because if it's not true to what you feel and what you're passionate about, it's not going to come across as well. So that was kind of liberating for me to just, I like vampires, write about vampires and stick to your own person.
I think for me it was that there's no set rules. Because I was, like when I started writing, I read Stephen King's On Writing, and then I said, oh, I have to do it this way, because that's how Stephen King does it. And then you would read something else, and somebody says something else. So I think just knowing that there's no one way to do it, and you can do it whichever way works for you.
Something on the tip of my tongue. Yes. There's a couple of pieces of sort of cliche writing advice that I don't agree with. One is write what you know. I mean, just to take my whale book as an example, I don't know nothing about whales or diving. So write what you're passionate about. It doesn't matter if you know anything about it. As long as you're passionate about it, that carries the day. I've never really agreed with kill your darlings either. That's where you're supposed to delete your fanciest lines, I guess. I don't know. I always felt like feed your darlings and turn them into monsters. Like really dig into that stuff. Make it all darlings, like we go the opposite way. That's good enough.
Like rotters. You did that in Rotters with your main character.
Thank you, that's right, thank you.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorites.
It's a great book. It's a great, I love that. I think one thing, I don't think I've ever articulated this before, so I'll share this, because they've already taken all the things I was gonna say, but, because they're a great piece of advice. But one thing that I've found myself avoiding is all readers, as I said earlier, are different, and we all have, just like in life, we have our pet peeves, we have things we don't like. Whenever I see a thread anywhere, like Twitter, Facebook, if I hear people talking about it, they'll say, what tropes are we tired of? And then it's just like this, one after the other. Oh, I hate zombies no more, and vampires are awful, or I don't want to have another ghost story, please kill me before I have to read another ghost story. And I don't need to see that, right? So once I see a thread, or even a conversation with that negativity, I just divorce myself from it. Because I don't need that. I just don't need that. Of course people are more than welcome to talk about that. That's great. That's how they feel. Express that. I don't have to take that input because that's not productive for me, right? I saw a Tarantino TikTok the other day. I was on TikTok. And he said that I'm making movies for me. Everybody else is invited. And even though that sounds a little self-aggrandizing, I think that's not a bad approach because you're making something that you feel passionate about, something that you love. And so you're not making it to fit this market, you're not making it to placate this group or that group, you're not avoiding this because some random person on Facebook doesn't like it, right? You're making something that you're excited about, and then if other people gravitate toward it, they do. So anyway, that's something I try to avoid, is when people start ripping on whatever it is that they don't like.
Yeah, write the book you want to read.
Yeah, exactly.
In regards to the don't kill your darlings, have you ever had a passage that you really loved and like either your editor or even your own just like reading, you realize it just doesn't fit in this book or this spot? Have you ever then like taken that passage and maybe like saved it in a separate document and then you're able to like reuse that somewhere else, or maybe even write a whole story off that chapter that just didn't work in that book?
Yeah, I think so, a little skin graft.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's a great way to
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I have an example.
Right, but that's like, yeah.
Totally, yeah.
That's what my editor said to do. She's like, I'm going to tell you to get rid of stuff, and it's not because I don't like it. It's just because it doesn't progress this story. So she told me always to like just take it, put it somewhere else, and then like try to use it later because it's so it's a good writing. So I wasn't sure if that was just a me thing, and she's just trying to be nice, or if that's something like, it's really nice. Cut it out.
So we've been talking a lot about sort of like general writing advice, but let's pivot a little bit in horror. Do you guys have any specific thoughts or techniques that you use for pushing people's fear buttons? I'm reminded of what Stephen King once said, is that he tries to terrify, and if you can't terrify, he'll horrify, and if you can't horrify, he'll go for the gross out, right? So, are there any bits of advice like that that come to mind when you're crafting your horror story?
I don't know if I'd say this is like a rule or anything, but for me, a lot of times, whatever it is that's horrifying, the less I'm writing about it, the better. It's something that's lurking there, but the reader and the main character don't know when it's going to pop out. It's like, and this goes back to like if you watch The Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch isn't in it that often, but she's there constantly because you don't know when she's going to pop out at Dorothy, or Darth Vader in the original Star Wars. He's not in it a lot, but he's like everywhere. So I think sometimes that helps build tension. That, like in the Vampire's War, the vampire who's creating the war, he's not in it a lot, but they never know when he's going to show up or do something. So there's kind of this fear based on his not being present that I like to build on.
Yeah, I think it's about, like, not necessarily scaring someone, because it's hard, I think it's hard when you're reading a book to get scared, but you can feel uncomfortable, and you can feel, like you said, the intensity of those different situations, and just putting the characters in a situation where someone is gonna relate to that. And I think that's how I try to make my readers feel my characters feel.
Yeah, I think the only really, for me, is that one thing I've learned is nothing is really off limits as long as it moves the story forward. You don't want to put something in there just to have a gory scene or just to be there for no reason. It should move the story along, and I try to use that in writing.
I think I'm scared of a lot. Like I've always had just a lot of fears. And so it's, when you're writing the character, at least for me, you are that character. You're experiencing everything that character is experiencing, and it's usually very easy. Obviously not every scene is a scene of fear, but when I'm writing a scene of fear, it's not hard for me to be in that headspace, because I do have, frankly, a lot of fears. Sometimes I'm not even aware of them until I've gotten them down, or somebody else points it out to me, and I'll be like, oh yeah, that does scare me. I guess I wrote about it. So yeah, I think being afraid helps me write scenes well. I mean, at least better than I would have otherwise.
So we're almost at time, and I want to make sure that we have another chance to kind of get some more questions from the audience. But before we do that, I just want to go down the panel and say, and ask, like, what advice do you have for any writers in the audience who might be interested in writing horror? And we can start with whoever wants to jump in.
I'd say just like, keep at it. Like, I talked about writing that creative final exam in history class, and that was 2004. And like, I just kept writing and kept submitting and kept getting rejections, and eventually, over time, there were less rejections and more acceptances. And I think just keeping at it and keep getting better.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The biggest thing is, as was told to me, is just keep writing and don't let rejections get you down. That itself is horrifying when you're first starting out, and eventually you kind of find your pace.
Yeah, I think it's really important to give it to other people. Sometimes that's the most frightening moment, because it's very personal and you're writing a story, but at some point you're writing it for other people to see, so you need to give it to people. And then be open to hearing what they have to say. Criticism, it can feel personal, but they're trying to help. I mean, some people are just mean. Most people are genuinely trying to help. And if you listen to that, you can improve your craft. But it's essential to get that feedback. And sometimes taking that first step is the most frightening part.
I'm going to say something that's sort of the opposite of that, but I think it's, not that I disagree with it, but I think they would work interestingly together. And this is, there comes a moment for me, or my career anyway, for that. But I think I also benefited for a long time from not showing anyone anything. Like all my formative years when I was writing books in middle school and high school. And eventually they were book length stuff. It never occurred to me to share any of them to anyone. And I think it's less common today because there's so many ways to share your writing online or in various types of groups. And I think not sharing my writing did a couple things. One, it made me get weird in my own little way. Like I was just in this closed room where I was just becoming my own strange monster with no danger of falling in the middle of any Venn diagrams, like if you have too many people read, especially I think at an early age or at the beginning when you're writing, there's a tendency to want to, especially if you're on some sort of site with there's likes or whatever, to want to try to, it's human nature to try to get more people to like what you're doing. And then I think the danger is ending up in the middle of the Venn diagram where you're trying to please everyone, but there's nothing unique. You've AI'd yourself. And then I think in a business way, it probably more than artistic, business really helped me to not share things for a while, because I learned to write by writing just because it was fun, and I'd finish a book and I'd just put it in a drawer, and it would never occur to me to share it, and that's basically still how I operate. Like, I'm very disconnected with how my books land with readers. generally for almost, I'd say 19 out of my 21 books, I have not read any reviews. I just don't know what's going on out there. And so I'm still writing in the way that I was as a kid, of just writing it, throwing it out there, and generally when a book is actually released, it's almost a bit of a irritation to me. Like I don't get excited when a book comes out. It's almost like, oh, now I gotta deal with that. It really, I would totally, if I was independently wealthy, I would probably be a J.D. Salinger. I'd write books and I'd still just put them in the drawer, because it's the writing that's exciting to me, interesting to me, and the release is really, really a far secondary. I think it's a healthy place to be, and I credit that in some weird ways to writing in isolation. But there comes a point where you have to, you might have gone off the deep end and need people to tell you that.
One thing I would say, this is going to sound so corny and so cheesy, but I think one thing that every year that goes by, I do this more, and that is appreciating the people who genuinely are with you, the people who are supporting you. I think that's really important, because it's like you're striving, right? You want this, and you want to accomplish this, and you want to, and it's so easy to have your eyes on that, and it's also easy to have your eyes on anything that maybe pushes you further away from that, right? Somebody being negative to you, or rejection, whatever it is. It's so easy to have your eyes up here and to not really notice all the good that's happening around you. The people who are supporting you in that, like that you're with, first of all, like in my case, my wife and my kids, and my grandparents, and my mom and my aunt. So it's so good to appreciate them. But then also, when people start reading your work and like responding positively, I'm not saying that you should live in an echo chamber, but I do think that when somebody takes the time to read your work and really enjoys it, that's special. That's a really beautiful thing. And I think it's easy to take that for granted. And I think that it's really important to appreciate that, to really just enjoy that, to let yourself enjoy that, and to be thankful for it. I don't want, you're awesome. Yeah, so, obviously, Emily here, I hope that are you too embarrassed?
No.
Okay,
no.
so
I mean, you're you.
You are so just awesome. Yeah, and like you, like it makes a writer feel so special. So I just think it's good to appreciate that.
Well, you write really, really good books. Like, it's always audiobook, physical copy, whatever. It's so easy just to get into it. You know what I mean? It's just very what's the word for it? Like you build the world, and it's just easy to walk into it.
Well, I appreciate that.
But I like you so much.
But you give as much, whatever, you talk about enjoying it, but you, like writers, when we hear that gives us just as much, or maybe even more. So thank you.
Thank you.
So, we're just about, I think we're a little bit over, we can take some more questions from the audience.
What is something, this is horror related, what is something that you will not touch in like horror? Like you're like, I'm not gonna write it, y'all can get like fucked.
That's a great question. What's off limits?
I'm not hearing not pet.
I don't think anything's off limits.
Not in horror, yeah.
I mean, you gotta save the dog. Always have to save the dog.
I've saved some dogs.
I mean, as long as it moves the story along, I mean, you can use John Wick as an example. The dog always dies in John Wick, but it moves the story along, so it's a core pop.
Well, I mean, it's Keanu Reeves, you can get away with it. Y'all are all monsters.
That's a compliment, I guess.
Yeah.
That's why we write horror.
That's
because
right.
I don't have-
You want to be a monster.
My editor is mad at me all the time. She's like, you killed another character. I'm like, it's happens, it's horror.
I think that I always feel like horror is the genre. I'm sure other genres feel this way, other writers feel this way. I feel like it is a genre of empathy. I feel like it is, I mean, the people that I know in horror generally are so caring and have so much heart. And I agree that everything is on the table, right? I agree that everything can be done, but I think it's odd, this is kind of odd, but it's all about the execution, no pun intended. But it is, you know, like, I think that if it's done well and for the right reason and the right way, it can work. I had, so in The Dismembered, this is a warning to anybody who reads that book. I love cats, so you can probably guess what I'm gonna say.
No spoilers.
Yeah, sorry, it's early on, the cat dies, and I hate it, and it like made me sick and angry as I wrote it, but it was important to the story, so it happened, and I love cats so dearly. Yeah, I just think that like, when you do something, if you do it empathetically or with that in your heart, I think that it works.
Yeah, I always, and sometimes I do this in my work, and I always respond to it, and other people do it. If they do something with beauty, I'm in for anything. Like, it could be the most twisted thing, but if they can jumble me up, where I'm either sympathizing with something that I shouldn't be sympathizing with, or finding something that is really, really awful, really compelling in some way, like, I love doing that. Now that is like poison for most readers. They don't want to feel confused about the morals of their characters or question the author who's writing it, but I would love it. I want to read a book and start it and realize, I don't know if I trust this writer, where they're going. Like, that's exciting to me.
I can't trust you now.
Okay, so
Yeah, I was like, sorry, I was about to like.
Yeah, don't ruin the book.
Sorry.
Okay.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Anyone? No?
Let's jump in. In that case, that's our panel. So I'd like to thank our writers, Damian Serbu, Daniel Kraus, Scipione, Jonathan Janz, Scott Essell Pratt. Thank you so much for being a part of this discussion. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
I have to go buy some more books.
Thank you.